So Rachel, and I don't know her last name, she appears in the court records as Rachel. Rachel was enslaved. There was a prohibition against slavery in the Northwest Territories. The Northwest Ordinance says that slavery is prohibited in the Northwest Territories. If you're living there, you're not supposed to have enslaved people. However, the U.S. military gave officers an allowance to take care of the maintenance, as it was put, of an enslaved person or hire a servant. So the very people that are in charge of enforcing the law are also allowed to break the law. Thomas Stockton, a lieutenant in the U.S. Army, was stationed at Fort Snelling in Minnesota. These forts are sparse places, and so he is seeking help for his wife. So he sends someone to St. Louis, and they buy Rachel, and they bring her back. They move in 1832 from Fort Snelling in Minnesota to Fort Crawford. And Rachel is tasked with domestic duties, and she's alone, and she's enslaved. Within a couple of years, she becomes pregnant herself and gives birth to a baby boy that she names James Henry. James Henry is held in bondage too, even though he's born in the free Northwest Territories. So here she is at this hinterland fort in the Northwest Territories, besieged with work, alone, and she has this baby. A few months later, Thomas Stockton takes her and James Henry to St. Louis, and he sells them to a man named William Walker. William Walker is a local slave trader in St. Louis and is known for his cruelty. Somehow, Rachel, with a baby, like less than a year old, escapes William Walker, makes her way to the courthouse in St. Louis, petitions for a lawyer, and that lawyer files a freedom petition for her. And her freedom petition was that she was held in free territory for years, and that her being held in that free territory and her son being born in free territory entitled them to their freedom by law. She takes her case to court. The lower court disagrees. Rachel doesn't give up. She files with the Supreme Court of Missouri, and the Supreme Court rules in her favor. They say that Thomas Stockton bought her with the express intention of holding her in bondage while he and his family lived in the Northwest Territories where slavery was prohibited, and she should be free. The tenacity and courageousness of a woman like Rachel is hard to really wrap your mind around. How does she get away from this experienced slave trader with a baby in arms, make her way to the courthouse, knowing that she was going to have to spend time in jail with a baby? How does she know that she had a case, right? How does she know the law? She clearly did know the law. And what cases like this remind us of today is that enslaved people were incredibly intelligent. We tend to think about slavery and people being robbed of their labor, but they were also robbed of their intellect. And as fully fleshed out human beings, they knew what was going on around them. When she was serving people, she was paying attention to the conversations that they were having and what they were saying and what was going on, because she clearly understood that her being held in the free territories and her son's birth in the free territories entitled them to freedom. And when the lower court disagrees with her, she doesn't give in. She has her lawyer petition to the Supreme Court, and she wins. Now, this may sound extraordinary, and it was, but it wasn't unusual. There were hundreds of petitions made by enslaved people in the Missouri courts, and hundreds of them won. we tend to think about Dred Scott. We don't tend to think about what came before it. And Rachel was willing to risk everything for her freedom and the freedom of her son. And this is someone who took her future into her own hands. It's important because it reminds us that slavery was contested. And it wasn't just contested by abolitionist whites. It was contested by enslaved people who were the original abolitionists, who were the most ardent abolitionists. It reminds us that someone that we think had little to no power exercised power. She's a single woman, alone, with a baby. She's African American, she's enslaved, and she's in the hinterlands of the Republic. Yet she finds a way to free herself and her son and assert herself, regardless of the situation in which she was in. It also reminds us that the question of slavery was hotly debated. It wasn't just accepted, and that it wasn't as simple as all white people were in support of slavery, or all white people were in the Midwest opposed to slavery. You have all of those things happening at the same time. We don't tend to think about people being held in bondage in places like Wisconsin, or what becomes Wisconsin, yet they were. And we don't tend to think about a single woman with an infant being able to assert herself in court, and yet she did, and did so successfully. So it really pushes against what we think is possible and makes us focus on what actually happened. And what we see is that slavery was always contested.